Hello everybody, welcome to Appendix 3 and this is going to be a chapter on IAM or Identity and Access Management, which is AWS's authentication and authorization service. So this is going to be the agenda. I'll be talking about authentication and authorization. What is authentication? What is authorization? Then we'll talk about users, policies and permissions, followed by groups and roles. This is going to be a very short video, but again, I'll be covering only those things which you need to understand as a data engineer. I'll not go into too much of details of IAM because there are too many things in IAMs which typically a data engineer does not take care of. These are taken care of by security admin. So first of all, what is authentication? Authentication is getting into a system by providing credentials, meaning that let's say you want to log into a system and we provide the user ID and password so that the system knows you are the person who you say you are. It is similar to going into airport, and in airport where you show your identity card and the security personnel checks your identity card and your face just to confirm that you are actually the person who is traveling. Similar to that, authentication does the credential check to allow you into the system. So example of authentication is login to AWS console. Just let me show you. So this is the AWS console, and if this is the ID that I'm using to login, and then I provide the password. So I'm providing the credentials of my user ID and password. Now, when all the credentials match, then only I'm allowed into the AWS console. It should be similar for your case also. When you provide credentials, you are allowed to log into the console. So that's what authentication is. Now, authorization is when I log into the console, am I allowed to use these services? Am I allowed to create EC2 instance, create VPCs, delete VPCs, create a Redshift cluster, so on and so forth. So that's what authorization is. So it is getting access to the resources of the system that we entered after authenticating. It does not mean that just because you have entered the system, it will allow you to access all the resources that the system has. Someone would have to give you some permissions and accesses to, let's say, work on certain resources. So that's what authorization is. Example is able to access AWS resources like creating EC2, deleting EC2 instances, creating VPC, Redshift cluster, deleting Redshift cluster, etc. Now, the first thing is that AWS root user. So what we did when you created your AWS account, you provided your email ID and password. Now that email ID and password that you have provided while creating the account becomes the root user. And root user has all access to all AWS services. Now here I am logged in as in using root user, and I can do anything that I want. I can actually create EC2 instances, create Redshift clusters, so on and so forth. So far, whatever I have done, whatever I have shown you, I have done those using root user only. So there was no problem in creating VPC, in creating Redshift cluster, in launching EC2 instance, so on and so forth. There's one more thing called multi-factor authentication. You might have noticed that after providing the password while trying to log into the AWS console, it was asking me some additional credential also, like Touch ID in case of Mac. That is what multi-factor authentication is, and you should always set multi-factor authentication for root user. Then we have IAM user. All the other users are called IAM users. So IAM users are basically users which are created for specific purposes. So it's not that IAM users will have access to all the resources. Definitely not. Root user will have access to all the resources, and of course you cannot share the root user ID and root user password to all the users because that would be very dangerous, and anybody can create resource, delete resource, so on and so forth, which is definitely not allowed. So that's why we need IAM users, which are typical users that we create in AWS system. And while creating the IAM users, we can allow the IAM users to log in to console using password. We can provide access keys also for programmatic access and AWS CLIs. And by default, the IAM users do not have any permission. They do not get any permission. Then you have ARN. ARN is basically the full form of ARN is Amazon Resource Name. This is a unique identifier for each and every resource that we have in AWS. So let's see the Redshift serverless workgroup that I had created. So this is the serverless workgroup that I had created in Redshift. And if you click on it, it says that there is an ARN. So if you see, this is the ARN of Redshift serverless work group. It says the workgroup ARN. This is an unique identifier for this Redshift cluster. Now, if I create additional Redshift cluster, all the Redshift clusters will have its own ARN. Or if I create Redshift serverless workgroup, all the workgroups will have their own ARN. Similarly, we have ARN for S3 buckets also. So this is the bucket that we had created, or I have created earlier, www.3am.in. If you click on this and click on properties, so if you see, this is the ARN for this particular bucket. So each S3 bucket has its own ARN. Not only that, I have opened an object in the S3 bucket. That object also has an ARN. So what I mean to say is that each and every resource in AWS has their own ARN. This is an identifier which uniquely identifies a particular resource in AWS system. So basically in the entire AWS system, no two ARNs would be same. So if you can have your account, I can have my account, I can have multiple accounts, but let's say I create multiple S3 buckets, if I create multiple EC2 instances, all of them would have their own ARN. So EC2 instance, security group, VPC, everything would have their own ARN. And this is the format of ARN. It starts with ARN and AWS, and these two things would remain the same. Then you have service, what service we are going to use. For example, it can be EC2 service, it can be S3 service, so on and so forth. Then it contains the region. So for North Virginia, it will be US East 1. Then we have the account ID of the AWS account, followed by resource type and then resource ID. For example, for EC2 instance, the resource type would be instance. For security group, the resource type would be security group, so on and so forth. And then in resource ID, it would be EC2 instance ID. So this is the syntax of Amazon Resource Name or ARN, and this is used almost everywhere. Now, as I said, service can be, let's say, any AWS service, EC2, EMR, S3, etc. And then resource type can be instance for EC2, bucket for S3, so on and so forth. And then resource ID would be the ID of the resource. For EC2, it might be EC2 instance ID. For VPC, it would be VPC ID. For security group, it would be security group ID, etc., etc. So now we have talked about users, we have talked about resources, we have talked about ARN, we have talked about authentication also. Now, what about authorization? How do you provide, how do you authorize a particular user to access resources? And that's where policies come into picture. Policies are nothing but permissions which gives access to AWS resources. And policies can be attached to users, groups, and roles. Groups and roles are basically two different sorts of identities. A group is a collection of users, and role is basically used for temporary credentials. But we can attach policies to users, groups, and roles. And this is how a policy look like. Don't get intimidated by the syntax. This is a very simple JSON syntax. So it starts with version and then statement. Now, if you see, the statement is an array, and inside of it, each element is again another JSON document. So SID is the statement ID. Then we have something called EAR, EAR. And what is it, EAR or ER? It means effect, action, and resource. Effect is whether you want to allow or deny of the usage, and then you have action. There are tens of thousands of actions available for each and every resources. You can get that in AWS IAM documentation also. And then we have resource, wherein you mention the ARN. So it says on which resource you are allowing the actions. That's what it says. So in this case, I am allowing all actions of S3 on this particular bucket. So this is how we create policies. And as effect can be either allow or deny. These are the only two options. And action means what can be done on the resource. And then resource is the actual resource. It can be EC2 instance, it can be Redshift cluster, it can be S3 bucket or S3 object, it can be EMR cluster, etc. Then there's something called AWS managed policies, and I'll show you AWS managed policies in the hands-on. We can also have conditions on policies like filtered condition, which can be specified with the policy. And the syntax of condition is something like this. And I have taken this straight out of the AWS documentation. We mention the condition, then the condition operator, followed by condition key, and then condition value. So the condition operator, condition key, and condition value are all in JSON embedded document. For example, let's say IP address condition. Using IP address condition, we can restrict access based on IP address, which would be something like this. So the statement, again, we have version, then we have statement. It should be in third bracket, this because I have written it wrong. But what I'm saying you here is that we have ER or effect action resource that remains the same. Then we have condition. In the condition, we are saying that the operator is IP address, and then I'm saying allow this only when the source IP is, let's say, this network address. If it is coming from this network address, then only allow it. There are other condition types and operators also. Let's go a little bit deeper into the condition operators. We have string based operators like this. We have string equals, string not equals, string equals ignore case, string equals not equals ignore case, string like, and string not like. Then we can also have numeric condition like numeric equals, numeric not equals, so on and so forth. We have date condition, date equals date less than, date greater than, etc. Then we have Boolean condition, IP address that I have already shown you, IP address or not IP address. And we also have ARN condition like ARN equals, ARN like, ARN not equals, and ARN not like. We can also mention wildcard conditions. So we can use policy conditions in our IAM policies and permissions to further scope the policy that we create. Let's do a little bit of hands-on. What we'll do is that we'll be creating a user called admin, and then we'll log into the console using this admin user. And then we'll see whether the user can create EC2 instance and VPC or not. If yes, then it's fine. If not, then we'll create policy so that the user can see, create, and delete EC2 instances and VPCs. So this is the policy. So after creating the policy, we'll have to attach the policy to the user, and then we'll come back and see whether the user can create and terminate EC2 instances and VPCs. So for that, I'll have to go to IAM console. And this is the IAM console. This is the dashboard actually. And I had created multiple roles. There's no users or user groups, etc. There are 10 policies. But before creating a policy, let me show you the AWS managed policies. So if you click here, you'll see the lot of policies are getting loaded, and these are all AWS managed policies, and there are a lot of policies available. So if you see, we have from page 1 to page 63. So you can imagine how many policies are already provided to us by AWS. So either we can use the AWS managed policies, or we can actually create our own policy also. Now in this demo, what I'll be doing is that I'll be creating our own policies. AWS provides approximately 1254 policies for all the services that it has. So these are AWS managed policies. So now let's go ahead and create a user. So click on user. We do not have any user as such. Click on create user, and I'll name the user as admin, and click on this so that we can provide user access to AWS management console. So select this and mention I want to create an IAM user, and I can provide a custom password. So I have provided the password, and here's an option which says user must create a new password at next sign in. This is recommended, but uncheck this one because I do not want the user to create or change the password as of now. Click on next, and then we can add user to group, we can copy permissions, or we can attach policies directly. Policies are nothing but permissions, and I'll not do that. I'll click on next and then just create the user. So the user has been created. We have this console password, and this is the console sign in URL, meaning I can use this URL to log into the console, which will be specific to the admin user that I have just created. So I'll copy this as of now, but I'll return to users list, and this is the user that I have created. You can click on this user, and there are multiple options that you can see. This is the ARN of the user. So I have enabled console access without multi-factor authentication. So we can actually create multi-factor authentication. Then create a date. When did the last console sign in happened? There are no permissions as of now. Also, user does not belong to any group. There are no tags and there are no security credentials also. So what is the security credentials? There are two things. One is multi-factor authentication. I can assign an MFA device. So if you click on assign MFA device, there can be two types of devices. One is passkey or security key. There can be an authenticator app like Google Authenticator or hardware TOTP token. So we'll not use any one of these. You can use these three options. We'll not set up MFA for this particular user. I did set up MFA for my root user, and you should do that also. And then we have access keys. Access keys are needed for running AWS CLI commands. So if you want to run, if you want to create resources or manage resources using AWS command line interface, using this admin user, you'll have to provide the access keys while running the commands. Then you have SSH public keys for AWS code commit, and then there are credentials for key spaces, X509 signing certificates, etc. We'll not bother about it. So as of now, we just will use the console's sign in URL, and that's it. And no permissions have been given so far. Now what will I do is that I'll be opening an incognito window, because if you open the console in that particular window, all the windows will be actually refreshed and will be asked to log in. So create a new one and provide the ID and its corresponding password, and then sign in. Now as you can see, I have signed in using admin user for in this particular account. This is the account that I had just shown you, and the region is Sydney. Let me change it to North Virginia. And as you remember, we had created VPC in this particular region. So let's open the VPC console. And if I click on your VPC, I'll get error. It's saying that failed to perform authentication. I do not have any authorization at all. I cannot see the subnets. I cannot see the route tables. Nothing is authorized. So basically, I'm not authorized at all. Even the authentication was done, I have entered the system, but I'm not allowed to access any of the resources because the admin user is not authorized to perform any of these operations. I can also open EC2 console, and basically all of these will give error. If you see, all of them are giving API error because I do not have any access whatsoever. I cannot even see instances, I cannot even launch instances. So because this admin user is not allowed to perform any operation. So let us go ahead and change that. So what am I going to do is that I am going to add permission. So click on add permission. Either we can add permission as per AWS managed policy, or we can add our own policies and permissions. So first let's add the policies which are already available to us and created for us by AWS. Click on add permissions and then attach policies directly. And what will I do is that I will see if I can give read only access, or I will type EC2 here. So we have Amazon EC2 full access and Amazon EC2 read only access. Let me assign this. So I'll give VPC Amazon VPC read-only access, there's Amazon VPC full access also. So click on next and then add permissions. So I have added two permissions. One is Amazon EC2 read-only access and then Amazon VPC read-only access. And if I click on this, you can actually see that in JSON. So effect allow EC2 describe, elastic load balancing describe, CloudWatch describe, and auto scaling describe. So this is the syntax. If you see this statement, which is an array, and this is the first element, and basically using this first element, this particular policy is allowing read access on EC2. In the second one, it is allowing elastic load balancing access, then CloudWatch access, and then auto scaling access. Now, if I go back and refresh the screen, all these errors should go away because I have read only access. So as you can see, there's no error anymore. Let me go to VPC console and refresh the page, and I can see the VPCs. I should be able to see the subnets. I should be able to see the VPCs. I should be able to see the route tables also in this particular account. So the reason I'm allowed because I have been given read only access. Now what I have to do is that I'll have to create policies wherein I'll allow only create EC2 instance and not terminate the EC2 instance, and I'll attach that policy to this particular user. Click on create policy. So let's specify the permissions. Select a service. I'll select EC2 and what are the actions that are allowed. So either we can mention all access. There's read and write. So let me click on write and scroll down. I'll have to give create key pair and then run instances, and let's see what happens. So I will just add these and then I will allow it in all resources. So all EC2 resources, otherwise I'll have to specify ARN. Now while creating, I cannot specify ARN because the resource has not been created. So there's no way of specifying the ARN. Click on next and I'll name it as 3IAM admin EC2 permission and then create policy. Now what will I do? I will select this 3IAM admin EC2 permission. So here we can actually select customer manage because we have created this policy by ourselves, actions, and then attach. And I'll attach it to the admin user. Click on attach policy. All right, so now if I go back to the user, this particular user has three permissions: 3IAM admin EC2, read only, and VPC read only. So here I have create, keep here, create image, and create run instances have been given. So let's see whether I can create an EC2 instance using the admin user. This is the admin user. Click on launch instances. Admin EC2 instance. Again, I'll select just like I did last time. I do not need any key pair because I'm not going to log in. And I'll mention 3IAM, VPC, so on, so subnet, etc. I just want to see whether I'm allowed to launch EC2 instance or not. So let's see. Okay, so it says you are not authorized to perform this operation, is not authorized to perform create security group on resource on VPC. So seems like the option that I had given was to create a security group. So instead of that, I'll select or I'll provide the use existing security group. And here, see, I had mentioned create security group. I'll select an existing security group, which is maybe security group public subnet 1A. And now let's see whether it works or not. So again, create tags is also not allowed. So I'll have to change it. Go back to the policies or the 3IAM policy, create tag. So as you can see, this is a very tedious task. So you'll have to see which one is allowed, which one is not. So what will I do here is that instead of providing this permission, I will remove this permission and then I will add a managed AWS managed permission, which will be basically EC2 full access. So I'll select EC2 full access and then click on next. You should not do it in production. Let the security admins do it. So I have EC2 full access now. And now if I go back and try to retry, now this user admin has EC2 full access. Now if you see, this 3IAM admin EC2 is getting launched. I can also terminate this because I have full access. If I click on this and then instance state terminate, and I should be able to terminate this EC2 instance also. So it is shutting down. Now let me go ahead and look at VPCs. Can I create a VPC? So if I click on create VPC, as I mentioned admin VPC, and click on create, it allowed me to create the VPC also because I had given EC2 full access. So I can create EC2 instances, I can terminate EC2 instance, I can create VPC, and I can terminate VPC also. I'll go ahead and terminate or delete this VPC. And this is how IAM policies and permissions work.